Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about dry in tests, so let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, my coworkers have said that the dry principle matters much less for testing. What do you think? I think that your coworkers, if my interpretation is the one that they mean, is they're very wise people. Because the problem with being dry in a testing, like when you're writing unit tests, is that uh, you might actually complicate your test suite unnecessarily, because the thing that you don't want, which I see a lot of the time with people who are a little bit too fast on optimizing code and following all the best practices and so forth, is that it's the same thing that people do with design patterns, where you lose track of the value of the design pattern that you're using, or the best practice or whatever, and you start applying it without really thinking about what is the good thing about what the end result is and the impact of what that actually does. And my favorite example in testing is that a lot of people create a lot of these sorts of utility functions, and like you were saying, they try to be dry, and they almost start adding meta programming style of code to the test, making the test harder to understand, which sort of defeats the purpose of the test. Because if the test is hard to understand, then the logic is the thing that, like, the actual code that you're running is the thing that should be hard. If anything has to be hard. But the code, like the test, should be fairly straightforward, ideally, to just understand, so that you understand what it's actually testing for. But if you add too much of this extra optimization to your test, so you don't have to write as much code, you might actually mess up, and people might not actually understand how to actually effectively write the test, making the cost of writing the test higher. And that is really, really bad. Because the best test that you can possibly write is the cheapest, dirtiest thing that you can get away with, that is still sustainable and can be thrown away, or like it's never going to cause you a problem. Because if you find yourself debugging your test, that is if a bug is bad, this is like the worst bug there is, because a bug is bad when you're debugging things in production code. But now you're debugging shit that is supposed to test the production code. This is useless code. This code only exists because the other code is supposed to be working. So if this doesn't work, but the thing that is supposed to be working is working, then you're really wasting your time. You're fixing something that should never be. It should ideally never break ever. And so for me, that's why I think that the dry principle is a little bit not as important in testing, because it's actually cheaper and better for you to duplicate tests and have them independent of each other, or duplicate a lot of the logic. Copy pasting, like the setup or something like that, is actually not that much of a problem, because a lot of the unit tests that you write, some of them may never change ever. You might write them once, and this logic never changes ever again. Or your logic changes and the tests become redundant and you have to throw them away. So optimizing code that may be thrown away at any given moment, or may never ever change ever again, is not really worth it's not worth investing into very, very good, a strong emphasis on best practices all the time here. It's about cost value, as I like to say. Being dry doesn't mean that you have to optimize everything to the point where everything is in a function that's called another function or so forth. But it doesn't mean that you have to go crazy and just try to write bad code for the sake of writing bad code. But the best guideline that I can give you is, as I said, keep the test isolated. It's fine to copy paste multiple tests and basically duplicate all the setup logic over and over, because, as I said, you don't actually know if the change that you might do in the future is going to force you to update all of those instances, and usually it's not that much of a job to do that. But it's very often that you might find that something never changes, that the tests stay the same forever, or you might just add more tests. You're actually never changing the old ones, so the cost, once again, like copy-paste coding, guys, is just a problem if there's a chance that there will be a bug or a lot of extra work in refactors. But it's actually, for testing, that's almost never an issue, because as I said, a bug within a test that is completely isolated is non-existent. There is no such thing. You cannot actually introduce a bug into a test by copy-pasting 3 tests that are almost identical and just changing a little bit within like the setup logic or whatever, and changing the assertions. But that is possible when you run production code, because in that scenario your code is actually depending on other code, if that makes sense. That's connected to something, but the test is never connected to something. A unit test is just something that tests something else, if that makes sense. So it's a different sort of beast to deal with. And that's why I personally believe that the dry principle is actually not that important in terms of just if you're duplicating setup logic or to copy-pasting tests and just changing a little bit here and there. And I think that is actually something that is better for you to do. It's easier to maintain, and it's easier on average to throw away, or it's less brittle, if that makes sense, and less complicated to deal with than trying to be very dry and never repeating yourself with setup logic and things like that. Because as soon as you start getting in that space, it's very dangerous, and it usually happens very quickly, where people start trying to create like meta utility functions that just kind of abstracts even the simplest setup logic to the point where, oh shit, I find myself now actually debugging. You almost need a test for the test now, and then you're on a very slippery slope, in my opinion. So what I want you to take away from this is that I absolutely agree that the dry principle is not as relevant when you write unit tests, because the fundamental reason why the dry principle is useful is, number one, so that you don't cause bugs. Because if you have pieces of code that are duplications of each other and always have to stay in sync, it's very easy for someone to change in one place but forget to change in the other. But in a unit test situation, that never happens. Because a unit test should never be coupled together. They are isolated. You can almost think of them as isolated programs. Each test is an isolated thing and should never be codependent on something else. Therefore, duplicating it doesn't actually have much of an impact on you. It's actually in many cases better for you, because it's cheap to throw away, it's cheap to understand, and you can very cheaply copy-paste and just repeat the logic without adding extra complexity. But if you try to abstract it, the odds are actually that you're going to find yourself debugging your own unit tests, which is a big waste of time. I mean, a bug in a unit test is that is probably like the next level of redundant time spent on coding things. Have a great day.